This is Coach Schuman here with Scott Shay, founder of Signature Bank. Most recently, written one of the top sellers over on Amazon. It's coming out. He's doing his book tour now, In Good Faith. Talks about his spiritual journey, his founding of Signature Bank, and a lot of other topics that we'll talk about today as well. Obviously, for those of you who'll see this podcast probably later on today or tomorrow, the coronavirus is a hot topic, and we have one of the top people within the business and banking space to really talk about it. His company has over 50 million now, $50 billion in assets under management. Did over 500 million plus in net income last year. One of the best high touch banks in the nation. They specialize in really not just working with their customers, but hand-holding them if necessary to help them get to where they want to be in their financial journey and building their businesses. So without further ado, thanks, Scott, for coming on.
Hey, David, it's really a pleasure to be here.
So there's a lot to talk about, but I'd love to jump right into it. A little bit about your background first, and kind of how you got started on this journey. And how, founding a bank is not an easy task. I've often wondered, how does someone found a bank? And today, I have the opportunity to speak with someone who's actually done it. So I'm super excited about that. Tell me about, that part of the journey and a little bit about your background.
Sure. Well, I'm not the natural suspect you'd think to found a bank, because I grew up in a one-bedroom apartment in East Rogers Park in Chicago. My parents had the bedroom. I lived in the dining room. And for a number of years, my mother's brother lived in the living room. So I'm the first person on either side of my family to go to college. My father arrived in the United States as a Holocaust survivor with literally nothing but the clothes on his back and his papers to get into the country. So I'm not your usual suspect for bank chairman, but thank God this is a great country. And I had in the 90s, so I went to college, went to business school, went to Wall Street, and sometime in the 90s, I had this idea that New York was overbranched but underbanked. In other words, you had the big banks that were giving, reasonable service to the big companies, the Amazon, the Verizons, the PepsiCos, IBMs of the world. And then they were doing a good job because they had the girth for technology, for mass market retail and the advertising budgets. But I thought, for companies between 25 and 500 employees, they really aren't getting a good shake from the banks. And I thought there was a tremendous opportunity because, there used to be in New York, JP Morgan, Chase, Manny Hanny, Chemical Bank, Trust Company of Westchester, Trust Company, Long Island Trust, Greater New York Savings, Dime. I mean, I could go on for literally 19 banks. That's the number. And they all became JP Morgan Chase in the last 25 years or so.
Right.
So I thought there was a real niche to start a bank. Now, like you, everyone thought I was crazy. Literally, they thought I was, I don't know what they thought. I don't want to. I had two co-founders who I tried to convince to start it with me because, the thing, you're a coach. Not everybody is all skills. I mean, and I hear that, you have to work with people to complement your skills. And that's how you build a team, is if you get everybody who's the best at doing what they do. And I knew there were certain things I couldn't do. So there were two folks who I really wanted to co-found the bank with, John Tamberlane and Joe DiPaolo. And you can ask them today, they thought I was crazy too. They just thought this doesn't make sense. The people I went to get capital thought, well, why don't you try buying a bank? What is it? You're going to start a bank from scratch? It's a crazy idea. But sooner or later, and here's the thing that I felt strongly and ultimately I convinced people on is I said, we need to build, if we're going to actually be a game changer, we need to build this bank from scratch because it needs to have its own culture. It needs to be very different than any other bank. And I'll just give you the punchline. Fast forward, we did open the bank. It took us 14 months of work. We were losing $2.5 million a month to start. We had $42.5 million in capital, so we didn't have, that long. We broke even in 21 months. We went public in 34 months. And today we've never done an acquisition. We've never done, so we haven't acquired any clients by buying their bank. And we're a $50 billion bank. So it wasn't such a crazy idea in retrospect.
Well, it's an amazing story. How, just to backtrack a little bit, you have this idea that you want to start a bank, you want to have a high touch service, you want to be different than what's out in the marketplace, replacing a niche that went away when everything became conglomerates in the banking industry. And I remember that time period. All of a sudden your bank was this bank. It was like literally within like a handful of years, every one of these independent banks were all together in one way, shape, or another, and providing all services, merging all services, all that kind of stuff. So how do you go, like, how do you raise the capital to do that? And obviously you don't have to disclose the secret sauce, but some of the steps that you went to in order to do that, because from a business standpoint, I find it absolutely remarkable to go and actually open a bank. It's something that people always, you say money doesn't grow on trees. Well, if you get a bank, it's growing on trees for you. And so you got to, and you're helping people at the same time that you're doing that. So, and that's really what it's all about. So explain a little bit about that. Like, how did you go about some of those steps?
Sure. And I'm going to, I had the pleasure of listening to a couple of your podcasts too. So I'm going to try to tie it in a little bit, if that's okay with you. Because I think it's all about, in the end, building the team and coaching other people to be their best is critical in business. And I think that's why so many former athletes are such good business people. Now, some are really bad business people too, don't get me wrong, because they didn't learn anything.
Right.
But I have to tell you, we have as some of our clients, by the way, some former athletes from football, baseball, and some of them really paid attention to the business lessons that they could learn from being part of a team sport. Some of them didn't. And by the way, I think that those people who are part of team sports have a better chance if they're paying attention to learning lessons that are applicable, because it's always about the team. It's always about the team. If you're playing tennis, by yourself, it's about making yourself great in the best way that you can. But if you're part of if you're on the football field, I mean, you can be the greatest quarterback in the world, but if you don't have people who are on your front line, if you don't have receivers, if you don't have, if you don't have a team around you, you could be the best quarterback in the world, but it's going to be pretty ugly, and you're going to be pretty bruised up. So it's a lot about the team and a lot about conditioning and doing the right thing. So I'll tell you a story, and this will get to a couple of the points in one. We opened the bank May 1st, 2001. And this was a pretty scary thing because all of a sudden we now have 300-ish people. We've just hired over the last month, the last surge of, let's say 100 plus people, and we're ready to open the doors. And I got up and I said, made it up on the spot. I said, in 5 years, we're going to be a $5 billion bank. And in 10 years, we're going to be a $10 billion bank. So fast forward 5 years. we were a $3.8 billion bank, which wasn't bad. But for me, I wanted to do a deep assessment with my partners. Are we doing the right things? Do we need to change? This is a big time, we set a goal. It didn't matter that the goal came, was like came out of nowhere, but are we doing the right things to become the $5 and $10 billion bank? And we, really did that assessment. And we said, yes, we are doing the right things. We're getting traction. And it's going to depend on the environment and whether we can take advantage of that. Fast forward the next 5 years, we're a $14.8 billion bank. In the second 5 years, we grew $11.8 billion. And that didn't happen by accident. It happened because we were doing all the right stuff. And when the 2008 crisis came, we stuck together as a team. We're the only bank in the United States, if I could do one, I'm super proud of this. We're literally the only bank in the United States that during the whole financial crisis, 07 going through, we made more money in 08 than 07, more money in 09 than 08, more money in 10 than 9. We never had a down year. And I actually ascribe that. We're the only bank in the United States over 4 billion that can say that. And I ascribe that to I ascribe it to a culture. I ascribe it to being willing to look hard and say, the subprime stuff, it's really crazy. We're not going to do it, even if it's going to cost us money in the long term, because it's not serving our clients. CDO squared, that doesn't make sense. We want to be a conservative bank. We said no to more stuff than you can shake a stick. And yet, and we were criticized for it at the time. And so you have to be willing to take criticism, but you have to be focused on creating that team with the right culture. And we did. And, fast forward the second, it's not quite 10 years from when we were 14.8 billion. It's about 9.5. And we're over 50 billion. And we haven't done any acquisitions because we were doing the right thing. It's about conditioning. It's about, being ready when times are strange. I mean, that's what's going on today. We came into this, we can talk about it at some point later, holding those sort of values. We're going to stay really liquid. We're not going to try to do anything heroic. We're going to, and we're going to make sure that our team is together. So I sort of answered your question.
Yeah, absolutely. And now I think what's really fascinating is the ability to acquire customers from scratch in a bank, and that creating that confidence. So I give you my dollars as a small business owner or mid-sized business owner. What makes me want to come to your bank versus going to some place where they've been around for 100 years type of thing? I think that might be one of the toughest things and the most interesting things about what separates a bank like yours from somebody else.
So a couple things. Number one, you will never hear, you could stay here a year and you won't hear the term customer used in this bank. Everybody's a client, and by that, I mean, we are looking out for our clients. We're trying to figure out how to make them more money. And that's an important perspective. I mean, when the Wells Fargo thing came out, we couldn't imagine, can you imagine? I can't imagine anybody here saying, I'm going to set up another account for a commission or whatever it was, an incentive, and it hurts or it doesn't help my client. I mean, it's about, so I have this rule and I call it well, let me even abstract, because this actually does come from my book, In Good Faith, is I think the secret to everything, the secret to not secret, but the essence of all morality and the essence to running a business right is from the Bible, love your neighbor as yourself. And as Hillel put it in a practical manner, don't do what is hateful unto you to someone else. The rest is commentary. Go learn it. So like every bank, we have this, big, thick standards of conduct. But you know what I did a few years ago? I put that at the front and said, you know what? You got to read the rest of this, unfortunately, because of bank regulations. But just if you approach every client, every vendor, every counterparty with the view that don't do unto them what would be hateful unto you, you're good. I mean, you always have to put yourself in the other person's position. That doesn't mean we don't have to collect loans and the like if someone defaults. What it means
Right.
that in day-to-day business, we're looking out for the other person. And that comes through, I think, authentically. And by the way, if someone's not doing it, they're not going to stay here because we're not going to, we're a great environment, but if you're not looking out for your clients and you're not looking out for, and you're not, we have to negotiate with vendors. We don't just cut checks to vendors, but we don't do untoward things. And that culture has been so important. And I think, you said someone approached you from Signature Bank, I think before we started recording. If you met with someone from Signature Bank, you'd find that those values are imbued into what we do. We're not, if it doesn't make sense, you don't know how many times I've told people, who we've talked to, you know what your current financial situation with your current provider is great. Good luck. If situation changes, fine. So we think we're the best bank for businesses, for privately owned businesses between 25 and 500 employees. And even though most people haven't heard of us because we don't have a retail franchise, if you're in there, that group, and you're talking to other people like that, you're going to hear those stories over and over again that, the bank came through. I don't know. I mean, I do get complaints once in a while. Don't get me wrong. We're a bank. We deal with a lot of people, but that number is so overwhelmed by people saying, boy, the bank did the right thing.
Absolutely.
I get emails from people who say they're grateful they bank here. I mean, it's really, but that comes from values.
Right. I think the values and, you bring, your faith and your spirituality into those things. I think those are, anything in society, those are core values that you can hone in on to be able to always get people to do things in good faith and do things the right way and do the right thing. I mean, I think that's what it comes down to is taking the time to consider the other person, like you said, in their shoes and doing the right thing by them and understanding what would be the right thing. And figuring that out is critical to business success, especially, in what you're doing. I think the differentiation in banking is huge because, I using personal experience, I can't tell you how many banks I've dealt with that, they got a new client person every week in the office. That guy's gone and is doing. So it's and the locality of banks a lot of times come into play when you're doing banking. People like to bank local if they can, but the amount of, obviously you're in New York City, which is a great place to be. So you got a nice large small community at the same time. It's one of those things that people are looking for that I mean, I think it's a good time to segue into a little bit about what's going on right now and how how you came to write a book that touches on a lot of these things. And where did that come from for you?
Well, thank you for asking. I mean, I'm a banker, so I'm not like your prime suspect to write a book on religion, atheism, good and evil, all of that stuff. But I consider myself a lifelong learner. And I had a lot of people ask me, there's this bunch of books written by these folks like Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, The God Delusion, Christopher Hitchens, Why God Isn't Great, Sam Harris, Letter to a Christian Nation, Daniel Dennett, even Yuval Harari. And they're all really, really atheist books, and believe that God is bad, essentially. And the idea that, well, there is no God, but the idea of God is bad, and it leads us down all sorts of bad roads. And because I think maybe because people know that I'm a values-based person, people would start asking me questions about that. Clients even, they would have read Christopher Hitchens, and say, well, I know you're a believer. What do you think? Is God all, sort of like Tooth Fairy and Santa Claus and bad for us? And ironically, I got a lot of these questions, not ironically, but interestingly. And so I started reading all these books, the ones I mentioned. I read basically the major atheist books. And I said, you know what? There's a lot here that doesn't make sense. And I think it's important that there be a response. So I looked around for who's writing a book, explaining why those books didn't make sense. I couldn't find anybody. I mean, there's a few. Karen Armstrong's The Case for God. There's a few, but I didn't, and I'm not, I mean, she's a great writer, but I didn't think that it really satisfied me, and it didn't really satisfy other people. So when I looked around and I found nobody writing the book, and this is like the place that if you find yourself in the situation where you think you can do something and nobody else is doing it, that's where I think there's opportunity. So I thought, okay, I'm going to try to write this book. Now, I have to tell you, I never expected this book to be as hard to write as it was, because I got to get into all these deep issues. It was a 5-year, I gave up. I used to be, a series bicyclist, and I had to give that up. I did all these events, 50 miles, 70 miles. And I wasn't competitive but I'd finish the events. You know what I'm saying?
Right,
I mean,
right.
I wasn't leading. I certainly wasn't leading the pack, but I was finishing. I was in reasonably good. I was in better condition, and I was doing all sorts of other things. And I basically gave it all up, and I gave up not-for-profit boards that I was on. I just, like, whenever I had spare time, I'd be writing this book. And when I didn't have spare time, I'd be freeing up time. And I mean, I deal with a lot of hard questions, like, does the Bible make any sense? What's it all about? What is idolatry? Science and God, evolution, the creation, all of these issues. And I don't shy away from any of the sort of difficult parts of the Bible. And that took a lot of work, because I've learned that there needed to be a book that explained why it was rational to believe in God with all we know about science and the historicity of the Bible and our sense of modern morality. And I wanted it to be good for, Jews, Christians, Muslims. I wanted it to be like a real, like, go with the core issues. Why is there bad in the world? If we believe in a good God, why is there bad? Does prayer make any sense? What's that all about? Trying to put our wishes before an infinite God. And because I do think that our civilization is based on these values. And I think it's possible to be and I go through this in the book. I mean, it's possible to be a totally moral atheist. I have no problem with that. But I think it gets to not being a self-deifier or an idolater, because a lot of people who are atheists really aren't atheists. They just sort of believe in the God in the mirror, or the God, or some other, God, King Pharaoh. And what I try to get to, and again, is that golden rule. If I don't want to do anything that's bad unto you, that I wouldn't want done unto me, well, I'm not self-deifying. I'm realizing that within everyone, there's some sort of spark of divinity, or for an atheist, a spark of shared humanity. And that ends up being the basis can be the basis for our entire moral system. If you don't believe that, and you don't believe that in the golden rule, I think lots of bad stuff can happen. And I worry about our modern society devolving into that. I mean, we have, and the reason why I think this book was so important to me to make an effort to give up all this stuff is we are descending, unfortunately, into tribalism, where it's not about us being all on one team, or in one league at least, we're all on, fighting the other guy. And
Right.
that's a problem. It's a serious, serious problem for society.
Yeah, I believe that the Judeo-Christian values, which this country is founded on, and the openness to obviously accept others that are outside of those values is critical to this country. But the golden rule that you talk about, the understanding of God and religion and the rules and the laws of that and what it teaches of how you treat other people and the underlying belief system that guide people are critical, in my opinion. And I'll tell you my unique perspective on it, but are critical, in my opinion, to the success of a society. And you can look to other societies and their failures, and you can see where the lack of religion is usually a huge component of it. And I'm not talking about a fanaticism from a religious standpoint. I'm talking about healthy religion that focuses on values that God teaches us. And my father is Jewish. My mother was a Protestant. I had both in my home growing up, and I followed the Christian faith, even though my father is Jewish. My father is my best friend, and he's Jewish. And so, and we have two, obviously slightly different religions. I became a born again Christian, and but our underlying Judeo-Christian values, no matter, even though our religions are slightly different, but understanding what the Jewish faith is all about, having celebrated those holidays throughout my life, even when I go over to my father's house, even though I'm a Christian, I celebrate those holidays with them, because my belief is that if you believe in God and in my case, as a Christian, or if someone is of the Jewish faith, your belief is that when someone takes you into their home, that you're a part of their family, and your job is to include everyone under the guise of the good Lord, to be able to help them better their own lives. And that's the way I look at it. And I think that's the underlying things that are part of it. That's why, I mean, this is to dive a little bit into politics. That's why places like Israel are so important in the world. Places where a group has been persecuted and has the ability to celebrate the Lord in their religion and have a home, and I believe strongly in that stuff in the Bible, because it helps, to me, it helps guide guide your life in a way that you are looking to help your fellow man in the best way they can. Not that you're not looking to be able to be financially successful. You should look to that to be able to help your family. You should be able to try to help others. You should try to succeed to the best of your ability, because that's what God wants you to do. And I firmly believe that, and I love the fact that you wrote a book challenging those thoughts, because Sam Harris, I've seen him several times on podcasts, and he's a very intelligent guy. And when he speaks on things with atheism and talking about the moral part of it, he'll make sense to a lot of people. And I think that is in itself the issue, because faith and understanding in, when you meet another person and you build a relationship with another person, that part is that person does right by you, and then you have faith that they do right by you, and that is under the Lord's will. And it's really, really interesting, because when you look at communist Russia, socialist Venezuela, I mean, you could to look at the modern times. Originally, communist Cuba, which became a dictatorship, and you just go right down the line throughout history, when dictators have declared themselves as the pharaoh or the god. All of those other forms of deity, I guess you could say, or ideologies, cause the collapse of their own people. And
So you are, can I riff on that? Because
sure.
I think you nailed it. Look, the Bible, the whole point of the Bible, the whole point was to overturn idolatry. So we tend to think that idolatry is, bowing down to statues. Nobody studies religion these days, it seems. So nobody even nobody understands monotheism. So they certainly don't understand what idolatry was. Idolatry before the Bible was everywhere. And we think it's like bowing down to some statues or some Wiccan chants. That's not it. Idolatry, and if your listeners remember one thing, remember this. Idolatry is a set of lies about power. It's about ascribing super authority or superpowers to finite beings, people, ideologies, natural processes, or in the ancient world, animals, not so much today. So how did Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot, the Assad family, the Kim family, all of those who you mentioned, the Castro family, how did Stalin succeed in starving a quarter of the Ukraine, 8 to 10 million people, killing all the kulaks, sending tens of millions to the gulag? How did Mao end up causing the death of 75 million of his countrymen? Because they used the same tropes as the God King Pharaoh in the Bible: pageantry, poetry, myth, theater, all backed up, of course, by a strong army and a set of secret informers. So they were able to, there was essentially no difference. And that's when the horrors start. When you get the God King Pharaohs who say, Stalin did all of what I said, and nobody questioned him. You want to starve a quarter of the Ukraine, Mr. Chairman? Mr. Chairman Stalin? Yes, that's done. Nobody would even think about that. And it gets back to that friggin' the golden rule, to the core golden rule, which is, would Stalin have wanted himself to be starved? No. Would he want himself to be thrown in the gulag? No. Gulag? No. Would he want to have himself killed because he was a kulak? No. But the ideology becomes the idolatry, and the God King who channels that, like the God King Pharaoh, is the decider. That's where all truth comes from. God King says, throw the Israelite baby boys into the Nile. Well, that's truth. God King says whatever. Hitler said Jews were vermin, and to kill them was nothing. Well, that's what people believed, and we've seen that in all sorts of other genocides. Now, here's the other thing, and it's so important, is that idolatry happens not only on a macro basis, but it also happens on a micro basis, on the level of our intimate encounters. How did Harvey Weinstein and Kevin Spacey and Matt Lauer and Charlie Rose, how were they successful? I don't mean that how were they able, that's a better word, to abuse so many people, mostly women, but also other people, also men? Because they exercised super authority, where just like the gods, your fate was at their whim. And people bought into that because they were idols within their industries. So if Harvey Weinstein said you were getting a role or you weren't getting a role, it had nothing to do with your talent. It wasn't regular appropriate authority. It was super authority. It was at his whim. And you know what? That sort of setting himself up as an idol worked. It worked, unfortunately, very well. The thing the Bible teaches us, though, is that every idol can be toppled. Ultimately, even the God King can be toppled. Ultimately, Achashverosh can be toppled, and onward, and in the Bible. And I think you nailed it in that if you don't have that sense of the golden rule, which emanates from monotheism, then you're going nowhere. I mean, I'm on a book tour, as you know, and I'm doing probably 80% of what I'm doing, 80% is in front of with Christian audiences. But interestingly, and people can find this on my website, scottshay.com, that I did a Google Book Talk. And so I was in front of a whole bunch of millennials and Gen Zers who were asking questions about, do we need God? Well, can't we just figure this out for ourselves? And the answer is, and one person asked me, I don't know whether it was on camera or off, isn't Kant good enough? Well, the answer is no. The answer is that we've never found a morality that works better than the Bible. I mean, I challenge everybody. I go through some of them in the book. None of them, all these fancy names, moral deontology and utilitarianism, they all end up going off the deep end. I mean, that's why, Peter Singer, who's the leading moral philosopher of the atheists right now, and Richard Dawkins both believe in infanticide. They're not even talking. It's not that they're talking about when you have the live baby who
Right.
is, under a couple of years old, and you find that they have some sort of defect. Well, in order to save society, the costs of that taking care of that baby will grow into a person, infanticide, they would say, is appropriate. And you know what? From their perspective, it's logical because it could save, society many, many millions of dollars. And it is comes from the morals that they have, which is the greatest good for the greatest number. But infanticide, in my view, is not such a nice thing. And it
Right.
and it leads to all sorts of other horrors because it's a slippery slope, infanticide.
Well, that's the problem with utilitarianism and the best for the most good is that what about the people that are handicapped or inferior physically or mentally in certain ways? And that's where God comes in. That is our job, to heal the sick, to help the poor, and to do those kind of things. I think when you believe, when people believe in the God King, the environment and the community descends into anarchy. And when people think of anarchy, they think of anarchy as people running in the streets doing whatever they want. Anarchy is Stalinism. That's anarchy, because that's people doing whatever they feel they feel like doing. And that's what anarchy is. And that's where, atheism is an issue. And those kind of thoughts, and like I said, communism, socialism, and those are the things where you start to make decisions that seem like logical, but they're anarchical decisions, and those decisions descend society into chaos where people live in fear. And probably a good way to segue into right now is when you have a disease like where you have a virus that's going around, everything becomes predicated off fear. And when you don't have underlying beliefs in the Lord and the power that comes from, people lose faith in what's going on in society, and you see things like what's going on, and they start to feel like there's no hope. They bleed the shop rights of all of their toilet paper and essential goods because they feel like their world is coming to the end, and it's an alarming thought process that can happen anywhere. I mean, it's obviously it's happened throughout the world throughout this process. But I say thank God, thank the Lord for the United States that has some sanity in how we go about things. Because if you read any stories in North Korea, where there is no they say there's no virus there, no coronavirus there, right? But there was a story where someone came across the border from China, and they suspected them of having the coronavirus. They quarantined them. The person violated their quarantine, and they executed them.
Yeah.
That's what happens when you have
Yeah.
no Judeo-Christian values.
Yeah.
That's what happens where anything can be anything. And to me, that's a form of anarchy. They might be within the communist system, but well, you violated the quarantine. Okay, well, we don't want the virus going to another person, so we kill that person, and that person's life has zero value. And that's a monumental issue, and that's one of the things that we have to be very careful with in this process in America and how we handle things.
There's no question. Look, I think the Bible does give some lessons. In Kings 2, it talks about when there's plenty of plagues and plenty of panics in the Bible. And, and the lesson is that when they're dealt with correctly, things are okay. When they're dealt with incorrectly, things can be very, very bad. I mean, there's a story in Kings 2 of when Jerusalem was surrounded by the Assyrians, and they ended up having a panic, and they all fled because of a panic. They were in the superior position, but they gave it all up and they started running. I mean, that was divinely induced, obviously, but there are stories in the Bible about when the Israelites panicked. And the real issue is in the Bible is, if you have faith, don't despair, create a plan. And that comes through time and time again. If you have faith, make a plan. And, have belief that if you are doing the right thing, that you'll get sort of a wind to your back if you have a plan.
Absolutely.
If you believe.
My favorite story is the one of Solomon with the baby and the two women that claim to be the mother of the baby. And he says, okay, both of you claim to be the mother of the baby. What we'll do is we'll cut the baby in half, and each of you can have half the baby. And the one supposed mother says, okay, go do it. And the other one says, no, do not do that. Give her the baby. And that's how he realized that's who the mother was. Because the way that you care for other people, when the idea that the person who really is the mother is willing to give up their own child so that child lives. And it's a great story because it teaches you, how to make a good decision and how to get people to make the right decision and how to find out who the believers are and the people who care about others and apply the golden rule and the ones who don't.
So just like we were talking about the macro basis and the micro basis, the epic encounters, what I think most people don't get is that story at the beginning of Kings serves as a metaphor for the whole book, which is that ultimately the kingdoms of Israel are divided. There's the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judea. And ultimately, by dividing the baby, if you will, of the whole country, both end up being destroyed. I mean, in the case of the southern kingdom, they come back, but they're destroyed. I mean, also as a body politic, if we divide ourselves,
right,
we're in danger. And I think, unfortunately, in this world, and currently, we have divided ourselves to a certain degree. We've got the MSNBC nation and the Fox nation. And I don't care what side you are, that's really, really unhealthy. If we've got to think of the person who disagrees with us politically as a fellow human being. And now, in many cases, if you disagree with someone, you demonize that person. I mean, what Chuck Schumer did, unfortunately, he was saying you Gorich and you Kavanaugh is not something that should be done. And by the way, it happens on both sides the other way.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Where you have Republicans demonizing Democrats. uh, you can
Right.
disagree as much as you want, but accept that that other person was also created in the image of God.
Right. You could this is the biggest issue I have. You could disagree on ideas and the way of going about things, but to demonize people because they disagree on ideas and the way of going about things, it 100% creates a divisiveness where people are forced to stand on one side or the other. And if you're stuck in the middle, you really truly are. If you're a person that has rational, discourse, and you think people can talk within each other, you end up being in the minority of the situation, and that becomes very dangerous because you have extremes on both ends, but the majority of people really either lean one way or lean the other, but are for the most part near the middle. And when you get people completely seeing, and I think media is a huge, huge issue. And no matter what side you believe is right or wrong, they're forced to both go to extremes to get their point across, because the only thing they care about is viewership. That's the only thing they care about. It's part of human nature. People are worried about themselves, and when they worry about themselves in the absence of any faith, they start to do things where they go to extremes. And what has happened in the beauty of business, where you can watch TV on many different platforms, right? Like what we're doing, and many different people have ideas. People like me or you would have been pigeonholed as CEO or coach and not be able to talk about these ideas. Now we can, because there's more forums. But what happens on television is you get people, the only way they can get views is to have extremism. The only way they can get views and stay relevant is to talk about things that go to one side or the other, because they need to be able to have the financial backing for that. And that does create an issue, and it creates, a venue for people that have poor values to sneak in. And under like Bernie Sanders bothers me because he's got a thought process that would take our country into a direction that be so. Now he's not going to win, and it's going to end up being irrelevant, at least for the next 4 years. But the ability of him to get that deep of penetration under the guise of that he's a Democrat. Like, I said, hey, this was my whole thing. No one's telling you can't run for president. Why don't you run for under the political party that you actually are? Instead of using the Democrat to be able to run as a socialist. No one's telling you can't run as a socialist. Go run as a socialist. Tell when you're busy telling everybody what you want to do, that's fine, but run under the truth of what you represent. And I find that I find it so interesting that it's one of the things where young people, the generation right behind me, has so many things where they felt lost on. They rally behind something that they, for the most part, felt that they could rely on. And because they feel like all these other things, and that's because they've lost faith. When in society, if you see the downward trend of faith, and especially the generation which is behind me, I'm 45 years old, that generation behind me, the millennials, for the most part, they have struggled with faith because my generation and maybe your generation hasn't made it as important as it should be. And a lot of it was because we were going through school and people were telling us that it shouldn't be that important. I really had to learn a lot of it, even though I went to church each week. Things become ingrained on you that's not the way to think, and you really have to be intelligent enough and thoughtful enough to be able to think for yourself and seek out. And that's what I did in order to grow my own faith. But a lot of people won't do that. And I think that's one of the things that could be troublesome in America, and it's one of the things that we have to work hard. And I love that you have that as the first thing before people meet with their clients as their business, because every one of the people that work for you that meet with clients, before they shake their hand, or maybe now it's an elbow bump, but whatever it
Elbow,
is,
right.
before they give them an elbow
The
bump.
Wuhan shake, you know.
Yes, yes. I always wondered, by the way, did the Japanese bow because maybe thousands of years ago there was something that they had to move away from, that some form of contact.
Well, the Bible, I think it's, if I'm not mistaken, it's in chapter 31 of Exodus, says you should wash your hands and feet lest you die.
There you go.
I want to say it's 31, Exodus 31:32, but I could be wrong. I could look it up, but it's in there.
That's interesting.
That I'm sure of.
That I didn't know. That's fantastic.
Let me see if I'm right here. I have a, yeah, let's see if I'm right here. 31. Right. Hold on. I'd be pretty happy about that if I nailed the actual verse. Well, I don't know. Let's see. I don't want to keep looking, but in any event, it's in there. It's in Exodus.
That is okay. Cool.
That I can attest to. I don't think it's that verse, but it's around there. It's when they're talking. It's when the tabernacle is being described. But I am going to have to say I'm on book tour, so I have something
yes,
I
I'll
have
let you
to go to. So
fantastic.
if I could just say this,
sure.
If anybody's interested in, just you can read some of the articles I've written that sort of tie faith. I asked the question. Wrote an article which has gotten tremendous. I've written a couple that have really gotten tremendous response. Is the Bible socialist? Is one. I wrote a story that went viral in Asia, no pun intended, called "The Hong Kong Protests. It's Monotheism Stupid." And people can watch the Google Book Talk that I did. People can watch me debate Michael Shermer, who's another big name atheist. There's all sorts of stuff that I've done. I did a TED Talk, a TEDx talk on bankings. And of course, I encourage people to look at my books, In Good Faith. My name is Scott Shay, S-H-A-Y. It can be bought at bookstores everywhere. It's on Amazon, of course. It's got an Audible edition read by Andrew Totelis. And some church groups are using it. I know there's at least, probably about a dozen church groups and other groups using the book on a weekly basis for a discussion group. And there's a discussion guide on my website too, which you can download for free. So you can get sort of a summary of the book if you want.
A website, scottshay.com.
It is S-H-A-Y. Two T's. Cool.
And if they wanted to reach out to you and someone wanted to book you on another podcast, they reach right there on the website. They can reach out to you.
They can reach out to me on the website. I get there's a place, a contact form, and I do get for media and I do speak at some churches, synagogues, and the like too.
Perfect. It was fantastic having you on. I don't want to hold you up anymore, but it was great talk. I really enjoyed it, Scott, and best of luck to you.
All good things, David. It really is a pleasure.
Pleasure. Have a great day.
You too. Bye.